Tonight, the British monarchy shifts forever. A royal decree strips Camilla's title. King Charles abdicates, and Queen Catherine rises beside King William V. Inside Buckingham Palace, palace silence hides betrayal, shadow regency fears, and a crown realignment that marks the end of an era dramatically. The announcement that stunned the nation began behind the guarded walls of Buckingham Palace, where a historic royal decision unfolded in near total secrecy. Senior officials gathered under tense formality, expecting routine protocol, unaware they were about to witness a royal succession crisis that would redefine the crown. When the Lord Chamberlain rose to read the proclamation, the room fell into immediate palace silence. The message was direct and irreversible. Camilla's title revoked. No ceremonial softening, no gradual transition. Just a clear declaration that the Queen Consort removed from her position under a binding royal decree. The words echoed like a crown stripped from its wearer. Witnesses described Camilla in tears, her composure dissolving as the magnitude of the moment became undeniable. This was not gossip, scandal, or tabloid rumor. It was a formal royal correction driven by law, authority, and a calculated pursuit of royal integrity. King Charles' abdication had already been prepared in advance. But before stepping aside, he signed a succession law designed to prevent a monarchy shaken by manipulation and internal power plays. His final ruling became the legal foundation for the British monarchy shift now unfolding. At the center of this transition stood Queen Catherine. Her ascension was not framed as ambition, but as duty. She did not smile, celebrate, or acknowledge triumph. Instead, she remained still, embodying silent strength as she accepted the weight of a Queen Catherine reign built on truth over tradition. Where others expected drama, she delivered restraint. Prince William, now King William V, offered no grand speech. His presence beside Catherine spoke louder than any proclamation. Together, they represented monarchy reform in action, signaling a crown realignment guided by accountability rather than appearance. This was not a spectacle. It was a controlled and deliberate reset of royal authority. Behind palace walls, a royal investigation had already been underway for months. Hidden financial trails, private influence networks, and signs of the growing shadow regency had raised alarms. What initially appeared to be subtle palace power struggles soon revealed deeper concerns about governance, transparency, and loyalty. The findings were enough to convince Charles that the institution itself required protection. The investigation exposed attempts to shape decisions through deception, including misrepresented health briefings, strategic misinformation, and unauthorized influence over succession planning. These actions were not treated as personal failings, but as a royal betrayal against the structured crown. In response, the monarchy moved swiftly, prioritizing stability over sentiment. Within hours of the announcement, palace operations began restructuring. Offices tied to Camilla's former authority were dissolved, staff reassigned, and records updated to reflect the Queen Consort removed from all formal recognition. Her presence, once central, began fading from official platforms, archives, and ceremonial references. It was not exile for spectacle, but a precise act of royal exile carried out without theatrics. Meanwhile, public reactions surged beyond palace gates. Supporters framed Catherine as the queen chosen by people, praising her composure and moral clarity. Critics debated whether emotion had influenced policy, but polling suggested overwhelming approval for a monarchy reform anchored in accountability. The narrative was shifting from scandal to renewal. For Catherine, the transition was not about replacing Camilla, but about safeguarding the monarchy's future. Her leadership emphasized discipline, ethical oversight, and institutional stability. She moved quickly to review palace governance, reinforce internal protocols, and restore public confidence in the crown's legitimacy. This marked the beginning of a new monarchy begins, one shaped by consequence rather than ceremony. As Camilla retreated into silence and her royal legacy erased from daily function, Catherine's authority grew not through spectacle, but through calm resolve. The crown had not fallen. It had been realigned, reshaped by truth, and secured for the future. As the crown realignment took effect, the full scope of the British monarchy shift began to surface. This was no impulsive decision. It was a result of a long-buried royal investigation that had quietly unfolded within Buckingham Palace. hidden behind layers of protocol, secrecy, and controlled palace silence. For months, senior officials had tracked unusual patterns, altered schedules, unexplained staff appointments, confidential briefings routed through unofficial channels. At first, these anomalies appeared minor, but over time, they painted a troubling picture of a growing palace power struggle. Concerns intensified when digital audits revealed encrypted communications tied to individuals operating beyond formal royal authority. At the heart of the inquiry was a fear of a shadow regency, a covert effort to influence the line of power, while presenting an illusion of stability to the public. Analysts flagged irregular medical briefings about King Charles's condition, some exaggerated, others strategically vague. The implication was chilling, an attempt to manipulate perception in order to accelerate a shift in royal control. As evidence mounted, it became clear that this was not simply internal disagreement. It was a calculated attempt to redirect power behind palace walls. Investigators documented unauthorized influence over council decisions, selective leaks to sympathetic insiders, and coordinated efforts to shape succession narratives. What initially looked like political maneuvering began to resemble a structured campaign. The discovery forced King Charles into a painful reckoning. Already weighed down by declining health and the burden of leadership, he confronted the reality that the monarchy he vowed to protect was at risk from within. The breach was not merely personal. It threatened credibility of the institution itself. In that moment, royal integrity outweighed loyalty. His response was decisive. Through a formal succession law amendment, Charles authorized a royal correction that allowed the removal of a queen consort's title under extraordinary circumstances. The law was drafted to safeguard the crown from deception, reinforcing the principle that titles are bound not just to tradition, but to trust. When the findings were presented to Prince William, his support for reform was immediate. Now King William V, he recognized that monarchy reform was not optional. It was essential. Stability, transparency, and accountability had to replace secrecy and persuasion. The monarchy, shaken by internal risk, could only recover through clarity. For Camilla, the consequences were swift and final. Once surrounded by ceremonial power, she found her role dissolved almost overnight. Her access to state matters was revoked. Her official presence within palace operations disappeared. The crown stripped from her symbolized more than a lost title. It marked the collapse of an entire sphere of influence. Witnesses recalled Camilla in tears as the reality set in. No public defense, no formal farewell, only quiet removal from royal duties, and a retreat into private life. What followed was described not as humiliation, but extraction, an intentional effort to prevent further institutional damage. In contrast, Queen Catherine stepped forward not as a victor, but as a stabilizing force. Her rise was framed not by ambition, but by necessity. Her Queen Catherine reign began under the banner of truth over tradition, embodying restraint, discipline, and silent strength. Rather than celebrating power, she focused on restoring confidence. Her first internal orders targeted governance reform. Offices were restructured, oversight tightened, and ethical standards reinforced. She emphasized that loyalty must be earned through conduct, not proximity. The goal was simple: ensure that the monarchy never again face a hidden attempt at control. Outside palace walls, the public absorbed the shock. Media outlets debated whether this was betrayal, justice, or overdue accountability. Yet polls reflected a clear trend. People viewed Catherine as the queen chosen by people, a figure representing calm authority in a time of uncertainty. The narrative began shifting from scandal to renewal. Meanwhile, the phrase "end of an era" echoed across headlines. Camilla's departure symbolized the closing of a controversial chapter, while Catherine's presence hinted at a modernized future. The monarchy, once threatened by internal fracture, now stood at the threshold of reinvention. What began as whispers of royal betrayal transformed into a defining moment for the crown. The institution had not crumbled. It had confronted its own vulnerabilities and responded with reform. And as the dust settled, one truth became undeniable. The new monarchy begins not with spectacle, but with accountability, discipline, and purpose. As Camilla faded from the public stage, the emotional fallout of the royal succession crisis began to surface behind palace walls. The world saw a title revoked, But inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere reflected something deeper, a monarchy shaken, recalibrating itself in silence. Camilla's transition from queen consort to royal exile unfolded with clinical precision. Her royal staff was dismissed or reassigned. Official correspondence bearing her crest was withdrawn. Security privileges were downgraded. Portraits were quietly removed. What once represented power and proximity to the crown was methodically erased, reinforcing the sense of a royal legacy erased not in anger, but in policy. Those close to her described a woman stunned by the speed and finality of the decision. Camilla in tears became a private reality rather than a public spectacle. She reportedly struggled to accept that her role had ended not through scandal, but through a crown stripped by law and authority. There were no press conferences, no televised statements, only controlled palace silence. Her departure from royal life was deliberately understated. An early morning exit, an unmarked vehicle, no farewell ceremony, no final appearance on palace grounds. It was an extraction, not a performance. Within days, her name ceased to appear in official documents, schedules, and communications. The monarchy had chosen containment over chaos. At the same time, Queen Catherine began shaping her reign with quiet intensity. Rather than embracing pageantry, she focused on monarchy reform designed to prevent any future palace power struggle. Internal audits expanded. Ethical oversight committees were formed. Communication channels were tightened to ensure no hidden networks could influence royal operations again. Her leadership style stood in sharp contrast to the drama that preceded her rise. Where others might have leaned into spectacle, she leaned into structure. Where scandal had threatened the crown, she emphasized royal integrity as the foundation of her authority. Her Queen Catherine reign became synonymous with discipline, restraint, and truth over tradition. King William V reinforced this approach, granting Catherine significant influence over household governance. Together, they promoted a crown realignment centered on accountability rather than optics. Their partnership symbolized a deliberate break from past patterns, a monarchy rebuilt through clarity instead of secrecy. Behind the scenes, the findings of the royal investigation continued to ripple through palace culture. Staff were reminded that loyalty to individuals must never outweigh loyalty to the institution. Training programs were updated to reinforce ethical boundaries. The message was unmistakable. The era of informal influence was over. Public response evolved as more details surfaced. While initial reactions ranged from shock to disbelief, sentiment gradually shifted toward acceptance. Many viewed Catherine as a queen chosen by people, a figure who did not seek power, but steadied it. Her composure during the crisis enhanced her credibility, reinforcing the belief that she represented a moral reset. International media framed the transition as both dramatic and historic. Some commentators labeled it a necessary royal correction, while others questioned whether the monarchy risked appearing politicized. Yet approval ratings suggested the public valued transparency over tradition. For many, this moment marked the end of an era defined by uncertainty. Camilla's isolation deepened as the monarchy moved forward without her. Her charities appointed new patrons. Invitations ceased. Communication with senior royals reportedly dwindled to silence. Her world, once filled with ceremony and influence, narrowed to private life away from the spotlight. The crown stripped from her symbolized more than a lost title. It represented a permanent separation from royal identity. Meanwhile, Catherine's authority continued to solidify. She resisted triumphal narratives, refusing to frame her rise as victory over Camilla. Instead, she emphasized responsibility, continuity, and institutional stability. Her silent strength reshaped the tone of the monarchy, steering it away from spectacle and toward service. As Britain adjusted to its transformed leadership, one theme became increasingly clear. This was not simply of titles, but a recalibration of values. The monarchy shaken by betrayal had chosen reform over denial, and as Queen Catherine stepped further into her role, the world began to understand that this new chapter was not about power. It was about preserving the crown through principle. As the monarchy stabilized under Queen Catherine and King William V, attention turned to the emotional and symbolic aftermath of the crown realignment. This was no ordinary transition of power. It was a moment that redefined royal legacy, reshaped public trust, and reinforced the principle that truth over tradition must guide the crown. Inside Buckingham Palace, the tone shifted from crisis management to controlled renewal. The corridors, once filled with whispers of palace power struggle, now reflected discipline and restraint. Catherine's leadership introduced a new rhythm, quiet, firm, and uncompromising in its commitment to royal integrity. Her authority did not rely on spectacle, but on consistency. One of her earliest priorities was dismantling the remnants of Camilla's former influence. Networks built through proximity and persuasion were dissolved. Advisors, intermediaries, and unofficial power brokers were removed from sensitive positions. The goal was not revenge, but protection. Catherine made it clear that this new era would not tolerate shadow regency or informal chains of control. The restructuring extended beyond personnel. Communication protocols were rewritten. Financial transparency measures tightened. Oversight mechanisms strengthened. This was monarchy reform in practice, not as a public promise, but as a structural transformation. Every step reinforced the idea that the crown must remain accountable to principle, not personality. Meanwhile, Camilla's reality stood in stark contrast to the evolving palace dynamic. Her royal exile unfolded quietly, away from cameras and ceremony. No titles, no crests, no entourage. The woman once central to the monarchy now lived in near-complete obscurity, her royal legacy erased from daily function and official memory. Those familiar with her situation described a deep sense of disbelief. Camilla in tears was no longer a fleeting image, but an ongoing emotional state as she grappled with the permanence of her removal. The crown stripped from her was not just a loss of status. It represented collapse of an entire identity shaped by power and recognition. Her isolation deepened as former allies withdrew and public attention shifted elsewhere. Invitations stopped. Patronages were reassigned. Communications from palace circles dwindled into silence. The monarchy had chosen finality over reconciliation, reinforcing the narrative that this was not a temporary setback, but the end of an era. Outside palace walls, public opinion continued to evolve. Initial shock gave way to reluctant acceptance, then growing approval. Many began to view Queen Catherine as the queen chosen by people, not because of spectacle, but because of her calm authority and moral clarity. Her silent strength resonated with a population fatigued by controversy. Media coverage reflected this shift. Where headlines once emphasized scandal, they now focus on renewal. Commentators describe the moment as a royal correction, a rare instance of the monarchy confronting its own vulnerabilities and emerging stronger. The British monarchy shift was no longer seen as instability, but as recalibration. King William V played a critical role in reinforcing this narrative. His trust in Catherine was evident in both public appearances and internal governance. Together, they projected unity, signaling that the crown's future rested on cooperation, transparency, and discipline rather than secrecy or personal ambition. Their partnership symbolized crown realignment in action, a monarchy reshaped by accountability and guided by long-term stability. Rather than leaning into drama, they emphasized continuity. Rather than amplifying conflict, they promoted quiet reform. Their approach suggested that power need not be loud to be effective. As new policies took effect and palace culture adapted, one reality became increasingly clear. This transformation was not merely political or ceremonial. It was philosophical. The monarchy, shaken by internal betrayal, had chosen introspection over denial, reform over resistance. Catherine's Queen Catherine reign continued to define itself through action rather than rhetoric. She declined grand celebrations, postponed symbolic ceremonies, and focused instead on governance, ethics, and public trust. In doing so, she reframed what it meant to wear a crown in a modern age. And as Camilla's chapter faded further into silence, Britain adjusted to a monarchy that felt steadier, more disciplined, and more transparent. The new monarchy begins not with fanfare, but with resolve. The crown did not fracture under pressure. It adapted, corrected itself, and moved forward with purpose. As the dust settled from the royal succession crisis, the world began to understand the true scale of the British monarchy's shift. What started as whispers of betrayal had become a defining transformation, one that reshaped the crown, redefined power, and rewrote royal legacy. Queen Catherine's reign matured not through spectacle, but through discipline. She never framed her rise as triumph over Camilla. Instead, she carried the crown with restraint, embodying silent strength and reinforcing the idea that authority must be earned through conduct, not inherited through drama. Her leadership projected truth over tradition, signaling a monarchy guided by principle rather than impulse. Within Buckingham Palace, the long-term effects of monarchy reform became visible. Governance structures were rebuilt to prevent future palace power struggles. Ethical oversight expanded. Succession law was clarified to ensure no individual could manipulate royal authority from behind palace walls again. The crown realignment was no longer a reaction. It had become a blueprint for stability. King William V stood firmly beside Catherine, not as a symbolic figure, but as an active partner in shaping the new monarchy. Their unity represented a generational shift in royal leadership. Together, they emphasized transparency, accountability, and the protection of institutional integrity over personal influence. The monarchy, shaken by internal conflict, now projected calm authority. Public perception continued to evolve. Catherine increasingly became seen as a queen chosen by people, admired for her composure during crisis, and her refusal to exploit drama. Support for the monarchy surged as citizens viewed this moment not as scandal, but as a necessary royal correction, a moment where the institution proved capable of self-reform. Across the Commonwealth, governments and royal institutions aligned quickly with the new leadership. Official portraits, legal records, and ceremonial references updated to reflect Queen Catherine's reign. What might once have caused constitutional turmoil instead unfolded as a controlled transition, reinforcing the crown's adaptability in a modern era. Meanwhile, Camilla's story continued in near total silence. Her royal exile became permanent. Her presence erased from official functions. Her influence reduced to memory. Former allies disappeared. Patronages moved on. Communication with royal circles faded into absence. The crown stripped from her symbolized not only a loss of title, but the end of an era defined by controversy. For the monarchy, her departure marked closure, not revenge, not spectacle, just finality. The royal betrayal that once threatened institutional credibility had been contained, corrected, and transformed into a lesson for the future. Catherine's approach to power remained consistent, quiet, deliberate, and grounded in royal integrity. She declined grand ceremonies. She postponed celebratory events. She prioritized governance over glamour, reinforcing the idea that leadership should be felt through action, not broadcast through spectacle. Over time, the narrative surrounding the crown evolved. What once seemed like a dramatic upheaval came to represent renewal. The monarchy reform that followed Camilla's removal reshaped not just palace operations, but public trust. The new monarchy begins not with loud proclamations, but with calm authority. The crown did not collapse. It recalibrated. It corrected itself. It emerged steadier, more transparent, and more disciplined than before. Under Queen Catherine, the monarchy shifted from reaction to responsibility, from secrecy to structure, from power to purpose. And as Britain moves forward under this renewed leadership, one message remains clear. The crown belongs not to ambition, but to integrity. What began in palace silence ended in clarity. The monarchy has realigned. The Queen Catherine reign is firmly established, and a new chapter in royal history has officially begun. If you found this story compelling, like the video to support the channel. Subscribe for more royal insights, hidden power stories, and historic revelations. And click on the screen to watch the next video in this series.